All right. I'm going to do the quick version of chapter 31. As you'll note from the instructions that I posted on your Google Classroom, I'm going to go ahead and knock this one out and probably the next one as well, while we've got some of this downtime due to COVID spread. All right. So we are talking today, chapter 31, about American life in the Roaring Twenties. All right. The Roaring Twenties is also known as the Jazz Age. There's a lot of things going on, and a lot of these things are actually kind of the effects of World War One. So it's also kind of relevant to what we're actually kind of doing right now in class with all of this stuff. All right. So this quote actually comes from your textbook. This is a Billy Sunday quote. He says, "A Bolshevik is a guy with a face like a porcupine and a breath that would scare a polecat. If I had my way, I'd fill the jails so full of them that their feet would stick out the windows." If you can't already tell, what we're going to be seeing here in this chapter is a pretty significant um, we're going to see a pretty significant reaction to what our soldiers saw over there during World War One. Bolshevism, obviously, the Bolshevik Revolution taking place in 1917, knocked Russia out of the war, turned them into a communist country. Those kind of things. Um, Social radicals and German Americans. This is one of your test questions from chapter 30. Social radicals and German Americans are two groups that suffered the most in terms of persecution and things like that during World War One. It's going to be the same way essentially after the war. All right, so let's get into this a little bit. All right. Um, there were a bunch of anti-red statutes, and you see the quote here on the right part of the screen. These anti-red statutes, some of which were born of the war, made unlawful the mere advocacy of violence to secure social change. Critics protested that mere words were not criminal deeds, that there was a great gulf between throwing fits and throwing bombs, that free speech was for the nasty as well as nice. Again, that comes right out of your textbook. These anti-red laws. This is a period shortly after World War One that we were going to refer to as the Red Scare. Okay. And if you remember from your junior level U.S. history class, you had the Red Scare after World War One, and then you had the second Red Scare after World War Two. Okay. And so this is all a part of that same thing. We're suddenly very afraid of what communism is going to be doing to our country. All right. So the most tenacious pursuer, this is one of those black boxes you're going to see here, the most tenacious pursuer of radical elements during the Red Scare was a man by the name of A. Mitchell Palmer. And he's basically heading up, he's the Attorney General of the United States, and he's heading up the agency that will eventually develop into the FBI. As a matter of fact, Hoover is actually one of his proteges. So everything we're seeing here is going to eventually turn into kind of the roots of what we call the FBI. A. Mitchell Palmer was at home. He was already kind of pursuing radical elements. And then all of a sudden, one of these anarchists ends up leaving a bomb in his mailbox, okay? Blows up a good portion of his house. He obviously survives the bomb and everything like that. But at this point, he is ticked, and he is going to use that fury to go and pursue everything he can in terms of radical elements, all right? These become known as Palmer raids, okay? We're going to start the process of rounding them up and shipping them back to Russia. Even though most of them did not even come from Russia, we're going to say, okay, Russia is the place of communism. If you want to be a communist, we're going to round you up, put you on a boat, and make you go to Russia. That was our approach to this thing. Fitting into the same context, all right, we have the pivotal and famous trial of Nicolas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, okay? The trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, if you remember talking about this last year with Coach Edson, these guys were both Italian, all right, which is a part of that same part of the country that is being persecuted during this time. They were both social radicals. Essentially, the backstory here is that somebody did a quick little B&E on a shop, all right, breaking and entering. And while they were in there, though, something went wrong, and they end up killing the shop owner. All right. Well, they took off, they escaped, they find the shop owner. Now there's a full investigation, everything like that. In the course of the investigation, they discovered that there was a car that they were pretty sure belonged to the perpetrators that was left just around the block near that scene. And so their thought was that they would just leave that car there as if they had never even noticed it. And then they set on the car to see if they could make sure whoever came to pick it up could get arrested. Well, sure enough, Sacco and Vanzetti are the ones that come to get the car. The likelihood is that these guys were probably involved to some degree in this B&E and in this murder. But whenever the trial took place, it becomes a very famous public trial because they think they've caught some of these radical elements at their worst, murdering, good John Doe citizens, stuff like that. And so this trial ends up being very much about proving that these guys are Italian. And it's just not a good time to be an Italian, and to prove that these guys were social radicals. And they were both of those things. But the trial didn't end up really being about evidence. It didn't end up being about proving that these guys killed a guy. The trial ended up being about their beliefs. And you can't, in this country, you shouldn't be able to go and give capital punishment to somebody based on their beliefs. But that's very much what ends up happening here. Okay. They are going to have this trial, again, not based on evidence, but based on their beliefs. And they are going to find them guilty, and they are going to execute them. And that's the end of Sacco and Vanzetti. We're also seeing the rise of what's called the new KKK. You'll remember in class, hopefully, that we were talking about D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. All right. This came out 1915. This is a very edgy film, and it's basically glorifying the role of the KKK, saying that it was absolutely necessary that the KKK rise up and we do all this stuff, right? So the new KKK is going to be a little bit similar to the old KKK, but also a little bit different, okay? The new KKK is going to be way more inclusive on the people that they hate, okay? The new KKK, they are against Catholics. They are against anything that's not Protestant. They are against homosexuals. They are against social radicals. They are against anarchists, communists, socialists. They are against anything essentially that is not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. All right. So the new KKK, it's also going to be a very public group. We're going to see that the new KKK, they've got offices in every town. They've got leaders and community organizers, and they're parts of the churches and everything like that. You paid a membership fee to have to be a card-carrying member of the KKK because it was a popular thing to do. It's kind of crazy. I'm going to skip some stuff here because I don't have time to really get into it. So what ends up happening here is the mood of the country against social radicals, against blacks, against virtually everybody, okay, that's not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It's going to be kind of the temperament of the early 1920s when we got home from war. And it's not altogether unrelated, all right? I know we're doing this one a little bit early, but what you're about to discover is that cynicism and dark humor and things like that, they're all born of World War I. And we find ourselves in this really odd situation where we've kind of lost our center. We've lost the idea of idealism and hopefulness, and that the world is this great grand place. And we've lost all of that. And now we're going to have a bunch of reactionary things like the policies you're seeing here on the screen. We started reducing immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries. Now, we have to do this in a way that doesn't actually, in terms of law, come across as discriminatory. We're going to have to do this in a way that is discriminatory but legal. And so they were going to be reducing immigration restrictions here in the quota system, saying you can only have X amount of people from this country, X amount of people from this country. And they're going to do this based on their numbers back in like the 1870s and 80s. And they're going to say no more than 2% of the number that was here at that time. Okay, which, as you know, new immigration really kicked in from Southern and Eastern Europe in the 1890s, 1900s. And so if you go back to the 1870s and 80s, well, it's just not going to be that way because they didn't have very many numbers at that time. So very, very few people from countries that were considered socially radical, like Southern and Eastern Europe, are being able to get in. Okay, the idea here is that we don't want to continually welcome in these ideas that are going to cause violence and everything like that as a part of this process. All right. In 1920s is also a time when we have obviously outlawed the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol. But that does not mean that all of a sudden the United States actually practiced prohibition. Okay, in practice, there were plenty of people drinking alcohol, and quite honestly, the 20s kind of becomes a big decade full of people trying to get around the policies and laws of prohibition, introducing the speakeasy. Speakeasies were illegal underground bars that, to be honest with you, what they would do is they would have hidden compartments in all of these places. And when somebody said that the fuzz, the popo, the police, the whatever, they're about to show up, they would immediately be able to hide all of the alcohol and all of the things that weren't supposed to be there in all these hidden compartments. And they're just down there having a good old time. Speakeasies, though, were a thing all over the country. This also gave rise to giant organized criminal empires, most notorious of which would be that one headed by Al Capone that you see right here in the middle of the screen. Al Capone's outfit was absolutely notorious, and quite honestly, at its height, Al Capone was making more money per second than anybody else in the country, producing illegal alcohol, having prostitutes, gambling, the whole racket, right? This is going to absolutely give rise to huge criminal empires. Al Capone becomes a public figure of sorts. There's turf wars and gang fights and things like that. It turns bloody and nasty and awful, and we'll probably do a classroom illustration so you can kind of see what's actually going on there with Al Capone. But man, it is a rough deal. I'll give you the full picture later. The most notorious day of this whole 1920s situation came on a Valentine's Day in the 20s, known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, in which we have Capone's gang that had basically paid off the police, sent the police in there to raid a rival gang outfit. And when the police got in there, the police gave way to Capone's guys, who came in there with shotguns and Tommy guns and blasted the whole group of guys that were there, blasted them to smithereens. This becomes known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And the images of this are absolutely hideous, but these images end up being something that all the American people are able to see. You see, we were kind of romanticizing the role of organized crime and Al Capone, and he's just providing a service that all of us want anyway, because everybody wants that alcohol and whatnot. But we're going to not see him in very romantic terms when these images start becoming pretty public. All right. Eventually, the newly formed FBI under J. Edgar Hoover is going to finally find a way to indict Al Capone, but they're going to have to use tax evasion to do it. All right. We couldn't actually prove that he was personally involved in murder and racketeering and in gambling and in the alcohol and all these kind of things and the rum running. We couldn't prove that. We had to prove that he just didn't pay taxes for all of the money that he was making, which you can pretty much get anybody over a certain tax bracket on tax evasion, because nobody pays taxes. All right. This is also the rise of fundamentalism. Okay. The most famous of which would be the Reverend Billy Sunday and the rise of Amy Semple McPherson. We see that these ministers are going to have big, colorful personalities, but they're a reaction against everything that they see happening in their country at this time. Billy Sunday, for example, was a former professional baseball player who had spent most of his adult life up to that point as a drunk, as a partier, as a guy who was visiting prostitutes all the time whenever he was a professional baseball player. Well, um, he got saved, to use church terms here, and turns into an evangelist. And now he's going to fight against the entire lifestyle that he had been leading up to that point. And I mean to tell you, he is a fiery, fiery dude. So we see this reaction also against some of the things we see happening in the country. We're also seeing another reaction. The trial of John Scopes is going to illustrate a lot of things, because John Scopes was a high school science teacher who intentionally, in the state of Tennessee, violated a state ordinance that outlawed the teaching of evolution in public schools. So he intentionally went and he taught evolution so that they would have to find him guilty of the crime and fine him and all these kind of things. But this ends up becoming another one of these famous trials. In 1925, John Scopes is going to go on trial, and Clarence Darrow, the famous jurist of the day, is going to be his defense lawyer, and none other than William Jennings Bryan is going to be the prosecuting attorney. Okay, now he's an old guy at this point. He's fat, overweight. This trial is going to take place in Tennessee in the summer. It gets extremely hot. William Jennings Bryan is not doing well. Matter of fact, William Jennings Bryan ends up dying like a week after the trial ended. That's how unhealthy he really had been. But the whole thing centered on the issue of teaching evolution in public schools. The whole country is having kind of a big outrage about what's taking place, that they're losing their country and all these kinds of things. And so that trial ends up, it was going to automatically be a guilty verdict because he was in violation of teaching evolution. But it brought attention to an issue and changed a lot of people's minds. And so it ends up being a pretty important thing. All right. The 1920s were also a time of giant economic growth, but the economic growth was also built on some really, really, really unsavory underpinnings. Okay, I'll have to teach a little bit of the 1920s economic culture whenever you're in class, so I can explain the economics there. But the mass consumption economy that Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, is running there is going to be something that is it has a lot of effects. All right. We're seeing here that starting all the way back in about 1907 and moving forward, that the popularity, the growth and the popularity of the automobile is going to be extremely important. So the rise of the Ford Model T, the mass consumption economy that comes from mass producing an automobile for the common man, the assembly line and everything that goes with that. That's all going to play into this whole thing as well. Henry Ford's contribution to the auto industry was relatively cheap automobiles. He didn't invent the car. Car had long been invented. The horseless carriage, they used to call them, all right, had long been in existence, but it was kind of a plaything for the rich. Now what he's going to do is he's going to put the car in the hands of the common man, all right? His assembly line process makes every part of the process of building a car very, 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 very simple, so that the employees at these factories have comparatively very little to do in terms of a wide expertise on how to build a car. One guy is going to be responsible for putting one nut on the whole dadgum car. So it's a very, very simple process, but the variation that you can kind of see here on the board is kind of a part of that, right? You've got the touring car, you've got the coupe, you've got the runabout, you've got all these different options here when it comes to the Model T, but it's essentially the Model T. Along with the automobile, though, we're going to see other industries that are going to end up seeing a lot of prosperity. So, for example, once you have a car, you now have to have roads that are smooth enough, as in paved, for those cars to drive on. So we're going to build highways all across the country, and that's going to be a big business. We're going to see the rise in the production, anything that goes into making a car. For example, steel, the rubber for the tires, glass, anything that goes into making a car, those industries are going to thrive. Furthermore, we're going to see a change in our culture We have a love affair with the car, and we have a love affair with the radio, and eventually we're going to put the radio in the car and just lose our collective minds. We're going to build vacation culture. Our people are now suddenly going to take vacations into little tourist traps all across the country. And we're going to have the invention of motels. All right. The difference between a motel and a motel has a door that's on the outside, so you can pull up with your car right to the door that you're going to have as a room. And a motel is short for motor hotel. Okay. So you can pull in, stay a night, and keep traveling across the country because we become vacationers because of the car. This also means the rise of little diners and restaurants and places like that, because you're not going to be able to have a home cooked meal if you're traveling across the country in your car. You cannot overestimate and overstate the importance of the automobile to American history. You can see here with this, iconic photo of a beach. Every one of these cars looks the exact same. I don't know how in the world you go in and find your vehicle in this mess of vehicles, but this is 1920s culture at its best. Along with this, okay, we're going to see the growth in advertising. Advertising becomes a huge thing. We're basically going to reinvent, like you can see the picture on the board here. We're going to reinvent Christmas here, because now we're selling products along with everything else, and Christmas stops being as much about family and these little traditions and everything like that, and they end up being a lot more about what we're purchasing for one another for Christmas. So there's the economy of Christmas that comes into this thing. But that prosperity that developed in the 1920s was also because of advertising and because of the easy availability of credit. It's also going to be built very much on a pile of credit. Prior to this, what we really see is that in American culture, you did not go and buy things on credit. If you couldn't afford to save up the money and then purchase the whole thing at once, then you didn't really deserve to have that thing. It was kind of a culture thing. But with the car, everybody's going to own a car, and everybody's going to be paying for that car in installments. Okay, so installment buying or getting a loan using credit, this becomes a part of American history. You can kind of see here that advertising is also going to have its own little, I don't know, aggravating side. Like if you see the picture here, this is an ad for Listerine. Okay, if you'll see there at the bottom, it says "End halitosis with Listerine." So by the way, halitosis is not an actual thing. Halitosis is supposed to be a diagnosis that you have chronically bad breath. Okay, but what they've done is they've invented the word halitosis to point to a medical condition, okay? When in reality, halitosis doesn't exist. But because they want to sell Listerine, they're going to say, you probably have halitosis. Many Americans have halitosis, and the way to get rid of halitosis is to buy Listerine that will get rid of your bad breath, okay? You'll notice here, it says she bags the bouquets, but never a beau, all right? You can't get a man because you have bad breath, yeah? We're seeing the rise of popular sports during the 1920s. Again, if you're not picking up on this, the 1920s are really kind of the time where we become, all right? This is still a result of World War I. Everything's kind of built on World War I, right? But everything in the 1920s is kind of where we started becoming who we are. And professional sports is that thing. And so for the first time, we really start to have our superstars. None more famous or more iconic than George Herman Ruth, otherwise known as Babe Ruth. As a baseball player, he started out as a pitcher for the Red Sox. And if you know anything about baseball, pitchers don't hit very well, except for, Babe Ruth was hitting way more home runs than anybody in his era even thought about hitting. Okay. He becomes the superstar. He's traded from the Red Sox to the Yankees. And whenever he became a Yankee, the Red Sox never won another World Series until, 2005, 2006, something like that. And so we have what's called the curse of the Bambino. The great Bambino is Babe Ruth's nickname, right? We have the rise, though, of Babe Ruth, the superstar in baseball. His name is going to be used to sell everything from chocolate to Coca-Cola to various things. Okay, so we're starting to see that superstars' names are used to sell products, which is still obviously a big deal. The first ever $1 million sporting event was whenever the famous Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight champion of the world, fought Georges Carpentier. And in this particular fight, you can kind of see the picture here. Everyone attended this thing and watched Jack Dempsey knock out Georges Carpentier. It was $1 million sporting event. It was a huge deal. So sports are becoming very much a part of the fabric of American culture, really for the first time in the 1920s. All right. Back this thing up to 1903. You'll know that the Wright brothers invented flight, human flight, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and their plane. Its very first flight was not very long. It was like 300 yards or something like that. But for the first time, a human got into a plane, flew, landed safely, and came back down later that day. They actually took like a 2 or 3 minute flight. It was a big deal. Okay, now 1903. By 1914, we're using airplanes as an implement of war. Okay. And all of a sudden, we're now using airplanes to crop dust farms, and we're using airplanes for a whole lot more things in this country, and human flight becomes a pretty big deal. Fast forward into the 1920s, and there is nobody more iconic and nobody more famous than the father of flight, if you will. Okay. Lucky Lindy, all right? He is going to be the first person to fly nonstop from the United States all the way over to Europe. He's going to take off in New York and he's going to land in Paris. And that human flight all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, it takes 33 hours and 39 minutes for him to do it. It was a rather dangerous thing, but Charles Lindbergh ends up being a very, very famous person because of what he was able to achieve. He also ends up being somebody that everybody listens to, and so he's the rock star of his day. All right. Amelia Earhart is going to achieve the same thing a few years later in her plane, the Beech Nut, and she's going to achieve that and many other things. But then she's also going to be most iconic for taking one of these flights and then going missing. Her plane went down somewhere, and we do not know to this day what happened to Amelia Earhart. The rise of radio and radio stations is going to be a big deal. Radios are going to be the TV of their day. The families would gather around the radio that's in the room, and that's how they would have their entertainment. You aimed all your furniture at a radio in the same way that we would kind of aim all of our furniture at a TV today. The very first talkie, which means that all of the movies before this one, they were known as silent films, as in you couldn't actually put words out of somebody's mouth and have sound come out of the screen and things like that. Okay, that's called a talkie. All of the movies before this, they would have action and action and action and action, and then they would have like a black screen with the words on the screen saying what they were trying to say. That's the way silent films worked. Okay, but the first talkie is known as the jazz singer, and in this famous movie, everybody shows up. Everybody's excited because this is the first ever talkie. And we see Al Jolson, the famous Al Jolson, step out there in his role. He's in blackface, if you can't see. This is a white man that's playing the role of a black man. And he's in blackface. He steps out on stage and he does this little dance. And the first words ever spoken on a motion picture was when Al Jolson said, "You ain't heard nothing yet." And then the crowds went wild. They heard a voice come out of a mouth on the silver screen. It was a big deal. All right. You ain't heard nothing yet. And all of these things combine to contribute to 1920s culture. Movies are going to be made like crazy. None of them very good, but they're going to become very, very, very important things. And so the rise of Hollywood culture is going to play a major role in this country. The 1920 census, I've told you this before, but let's make sure we understand it now that we're to the 1920s. For the first time, revealed that more Americans lived in urban areas than lived in rural areas. Translation: Americans have moved off of the farms and into the cities, And now the cities, people that live in urban areas, outnumber the people that live in the country. Okay, still obviously that way, only to a much higher degree today. This causes a little bit of a freak out because, again, if you're one of these people that live out in the countryside, you see all the crazy things happening in the city. You see that even though alcohol is illegal, they're all drunks. We see that the young ladies are turning into flappers, all right? They're little floozies that chop their hair off and wear short skirts. They're party girls. There's all kinds of sex and alcohol and partying and all kind of everything, and we see that the people in the country are going to have a huge reaction against this. They're going to fall back into traditional forms of belief systems and things like that, which is also, by the way, kind of what the KKK tried to chime in on for the 1920s as well. That jazz culture, these flappers, you see these girls with their chopped hair and everything like that. We see them with their short skirts doing the dancing and the everything, right? It's jazz, all right, in these clubs that are taking place. None more famous than the Cotton Club right there in Harlem, all right? So this whole thing ends up being a pretty big deal and leading to what we call the Harlem Renaissance, okay? Let's skip some stuff here. Jazz music was developed by American blacks. It's the first truly American music form, okay? And it's going to be famous not just among blacks, because the biggest consumers of jazz music were white people who began to love listening to black people play jazz music. It was not so heavily syncopated, and it was not so tightly organized as all white people music. It was so free flowing, and it's kind of what we've had playing in the background for this whole lecture so far. And jazz music is going to be very definitive of the way people felt in the 1920s. We also have the rise of some of these superstars when it comes to literary figures. F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. Okay, many of you probably read The Great Gatsby at some point or watched the movie, and it is very much the culture of the 1920s. And people fell in love. F. Scott and Zelda, they were the first super couple. Okay, everybody wanted to know what F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald were doing, and so we see a little bit of that stuff as well. In the 1920s, we also have Margaret Sanger that's challenging traditional ideas of family and sex, and she's advocating birth control. She is going to be the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she is going to be advocating abortion as a legal thing. And she's advocating for birth control, the using of condoms and contraceptives and things like that. And so she's trying to really push the envelope there, and she becomes very noted for those things as well. But we'll talk more about that in class. We had a whole bunch of people that were now moving, trying to move to Florida, and buying up land in Florida as the perfect destination, vacation destination. Now that they've got automobiles and everything like that to do that, but at the same time, about the time they all got there, there's going to be a giant hurricane that's going to sweep through and wipe out a whole bunch of these lands that had been purchased for the purpose of vacation homes and things like that. So it's also going to crush the economy a bit as there. All right. And then finally, we land in these last couple slides here. People were buying stock on margin. All right. And essentially what that means is that they're borrowing money and then taking their borrowed money and investing it in the stock market. Okay. Because the stock market in the 1920s was only having success all the time. Okay. So if you invest in the stock market, it's way better than investing in anything else. It's way better than a savings account. It's way better than anything else you can do. Go put money on the stock market. But if you're borrowing money to make money, that means that a lot of the businesses are being built, and I'll explain this more in full in our economic discussion in class, but a lot of the things that we're talking about in this country economically are built on essentially a deck of cards, on a house of cards. They're not actually built on actual fortunes, okay? Banks are loaning money that's being used to buy stocks, that's being used to buy factories, and all of this at a time when people didn't really have the money to pay back everything that they had been borrowing. And the whole thing's going to come tumbling down at the end of the 1920s in the stock market crash on October 29th, 1929. All right, that should finish us for chapter 31. Make sure you practice your test and then take your test. Thank you for listening.